King John succeeded as King of England on the death of his brother, Richard I. He had plotted and schemed against Richard, and he was a man desperate for true power. John was fortunate that Richard took pity on him after his revolts had failed, and Richard placed the blame on John being just a child, even though at the time of his revolts John was in fact a full-grown man. John did eventually return to Richard's fold, and he served the last few years of Richard I's reign reasonably loyally. But Richard died unexpectedly in 1199 during a siege, and the opportunity that John had always dreamed of was now right in front of him. One chronicler refers to John as Richard's rightful heir. This is not strictly the case. The actual rightful heir of Richard was his and John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was the son of Geoffrey, Richard and John's brother. Given that Geoffrey was older than John, and with both Richard and Geoffrey now dead, the succession should have passed on to Arthur, Geoffrey's heir. However, Arthur was still only a child, aged about 12 at the time of Richard's death. Child monarchs throughout history tended to not be very successful, and this gave John exactly the opportunity to snatch power. In May of 1199, he was crowned King of England. The spectre of Arthur, though, would remain hanging over King John's head. Given that he had once been known as Lackland due to his lack of inheritance from his father, Henry II, becoming King of England must have been a remarkable moment for John. Perhaps to show his gratitude to a higher power, one of his first actions as king was to go on pilgrimage to Canterbury. John had, while Richard I was still alive, requested to annul his marriage to Isabella of Gloucester. Now that he was king, this proved to be straightforward enough, and John divorced Isabella soon after the coronation. The news of his divorce, though, did not go down well in Rome, and with Pope Innocent III, with whom John would very much have a mixed bag of a relationship with. Soon after John's succession, his nephew Arthur came to visit him, and paid homage to John. This seems to indicate that the young Arthur bore no ill will towards his uncle. John, though, was rather dismissive of his nephew. Why? Guilty conscience, perhaps? Whatever the reason for John's motives for wanting Arthur out of the way, it proved to be not very sensible to be so dismissive of Arthur. Arthur then duly made his way to the court of the French king Philip II. Philip was a cunning and conniving man, and Arthur was exactly the sort of weapon that he could use in his attempts to win back the English-held lands in France. John then made his first big mistake of his reign. Philip, however, was willing to bide his time, and in 1200 he made peace with the English king, perhaps to lure John into a false sense of security. John, though, did have the backing of his influential mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who wished to see her son, rather than Arthur, her grandson, on the English throne. John's second marriage took place in 1200. This was to another Isabella, this time Isabella of Angoulême. From this marriage, John's heir, the future Henry III, would be produced, and John remained married to Isabella until his death in 1216. At the time of their marriage, Isabella was about 12 or 13, and John in his early 30s. In York, John had had a falling out with the clergy there after they had refused to adhere to a tax he was trying to place upon them. The Archbishop of Canterbury had attempted to intercede in the row, and he even attempted to grant a sum of money to John if the king would reaffirm the liberties that had been granted to the church by Richard I. John, in typically ignorant fashion, rejected the offer out of hand, as he deemed the sum of money that was being offered insufficient. Cursing the clergy, John then decided to travel to France, where, somewhat oddly, he paid 30,000 marks to the French king as part of the earlier peace treaty that had been agreed. It's safe to say that during those particular peace negotiations, John had had a number done on him. In 1202, John made his first act of aggression in France by attacking the Count of La Marche, who had disapproved of John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême. John had, just prior to this, extended the peace with King Philip, but this act of aggression had gone against Philip's orders for John to not attack any of Philip's nobility. Philip ordered John to come to him at Paris, but John outrightly refused. From here, John's misfortunes in France had begun. Philip's nobility advised that the French king should strip John of his lands held in France because of his aggression. Philip was only too pleased to hear this, and he had surely been waiting for his chance to kick the English out of his country, and John had given him exactly the right opportunity to do so. Philip attacked Normandy and other surrounding areas, destroying and capturing as he went, and he met very little resistance. Philip also took a moment to knight Arthur and urged the now 16-year-old to attack his uncle, which he did so, and Arthur even threatened a castle where his grandmother, Eleanor, had been staying. John came to Eleanor's rescue and captured a large number of Arthur's forces, including Arthur himself. Philip withdrew temporarily after Arthur's capture. The loss of Arthur would have been a blow to Philip, but John was now the one on the back foot. John's response to Philip was to fight fire with fire, and he caused great destruction at Tours and Le Mans. John then received a petition from Brittany to hand over Arthur to the Bretons, who were wishing to have their duke back. John once again refused, and the men in Brittany, unsurprisingly, went into rebellion. Things were fast spiralling out of control in France for John, and some around him advised the king to be rid of his nephew for good, and an order was sent out for Arthur to be killed, but the order was ignored for the time being. Rumours did go round that the Duke had in fact been executed, which would have only enraged the Bretons further. But the news that Arthur was still alive was quickly circulated to at least slightly appease the rebels. Philip then joined in the demands for Arthur to be released, and this John obviously ignored. Philip, though, was still making gains, and with less effort than might have been expected. In an almost symbolic moment for John, and how the war was going for him, Chateau Gaillard, the awesome castle built by Richard I, and seemingly almost unconquerable, was lost to Philip's men. Matters were growing desperate, and that year of 1203 saw John commit his most hideous deed. There are numerous explanations for Arthur's disappearance, but what is certain is he died on the orders of King John, and it's possible that he even died at the actual hands of John himself. One story goes that Arthur was murdered by John after the English king had become massively intoxicated, and after committing this most vile of deeds, John is said to have tied a stone to the young man's body and thrown him in the River Seine. I personally believe it's more likely that John had Arthur executed and buried quietly. but in the eyes of history it makes very little difference. John's treatment of Arthur, his own nephew, was appalling. Arthur may have sided with the French king, but John had pushed him into Philip's open arms by his own arrogance. Arthur also had every right to take John on militarily. He was, after all, the rightful king of England, and quite frankly, would have done a far better job than John. If John had thought getting rid of Arthur, and thereby getting rid of a rival claimant to his kingdom, would benefit him much, he would be proved wrong. 1202 and 1203 had been bad years for the English king. The following year of 1204 would be altogether worse, as John lost his grip on the French possessions completely. And what's worse for John is that it was entirely his own fault.